Okay, so Dr. Lewis, you are on.
Okay. Okay, so it's interesting. The issue of talking about attachment, just to quickly give you some background that I've been, my initial interest that brought me to Reich, I came to Reich in many ways from anthropology. I was trained basically in the area of anthropology, the discipline of anthropology known as culture and personality. So I had been very involved with the issues of human behavior, cross-culturally, but also looking at what personality is, and began to be aware. Before I'd been aware of Reich for many years, but since I was a kid, and saw the function of the orgasm in one of my cousins who was a psychoanalyst library. I said anything that was orgasm had to be, worth reading. So I started reading Reich, I guess, when I was 13, thinking I was going to find something that I never found. But anyway, but more specifically, I was involved in anthropology, and it's in that background in anthropology. The reason I'm being, autobiographical there is that it was in that context that I began to become aware of the work of John Bowlby and attachment theory, which actually goes back a long way. It's become very current now, but when I introduced this at the New School as an area of study, we were lucky if we got 5 or 6 students that would sort of come to. Now I get my class. I still teach it at the New School, and the classes that I teach usually have to be closed because we're over-registered. So it's the new grail. But more specifically, for many years, some of you heard this before, I've been interested in the issue of, orgonomy in Reich's work presents a great deal of talk about childhood and children. And actually, when you actively look at the literature, and Reich was aware of this, there's very little, really, about child development, about what children really look like and how children really function and what child development really is. And actually, when you look at psychoanalytic literature, until pretty much the 1950s, and pretty much around the time that Reich dies or gets into the period of persecution, in prosecution, there's very little, heavy, detailed research, okay, on child development in terms of what Reich had hoped to do with the infant research project of actually beginning to build a database, evidence-based knowledge of what normal child development looked like. And so, many years ago when I first started doing these lectures with Dr. Schiff out in Seattle, as well as here, at that time Dr. Michael Rothenberg was an eminent child psychiatrist and had been a student of Reich's, an orgonomist, was out there, and Dr. Schiff was working, and he participated in the seminars and lectures we gave. And at one point I gave a talk on a developmental model, which for orgonomy, and using references to John Bowlby and such. And Dr. Rothenberg came up to me and said, but he was always referring, he said, but you don't give anything specific. What does it look like? What can we really reference as the way children develop? And so, taking that challenge, I eventually, for years, have now been working on this, and it's become a very real part of my own practice of really incorporating the huge, not just John Bowlby's work, but John Bowlby, for those of you who don't know, is the individual British psychoanalytic, psychiatrist, child developmentalist, researcher who pretty much was one of the leading figures in what becomes the revolution in the 1950s of child research and child development, and really looking at how normal childhood operates and functions. And so I've been working for years on incorporating a lot of that knowledge. Now, attachment theory, Bowlby was always very, very suspect, and remained very suspect of psychoanalysis. He felt psychoanalysis was not an evidentiary-based practice, even though he was involved in it. He was part of the Tavistock group and such. Bowlby felt that it wasn't centered enough in the physical sciences. It wasn't tested. It wasn't empirical enough, and began his own research. He moves out of the work of Darwin in many ways as much as Freud, in some ways more than Freud. And Bowlby really saw a development as deeply rooted, and this is significant in what we were talking about earlier. Bowlby always saw development as deeply rooted in biology. But he also strongly and emphatically rejects the whole concept of instinct theory, which also put him in a strange position in terms of being part of the British object relations, the British psychoanalytic movement. So it really sort of put him off to the sideline, which I think in many ways was very good for his work, which is that he allowed him to do his research and his study and be left alone and sort of removed from the politics of the analytic world. He established an extremely productive relationship with a child psychologist, American child psychologist, who wound up working with him closely, Mary Ainsworth, who just died a few years ago. She, however, was primarily interested in how children actually interact interpersonally with adults and with their caregivers, and how children actually behave. And so she developed some very, very wonderful and very important, some of the first empirical test tools for studying child development, for really looking at how children actually do being a child, as we used to say in Columbia, in my program in Columbia, how you do being a child. You learn how to do it, in some ways. But she wasn't, for Ainsworth, she wasn't particularly interested in the somatic roots of these behaviors. She was much more interested in the descriptive processes of describing behavior. Bowlby always saw behavior as a product of biology, as a product of biology operating in an interpersonal environment. So that model, that schema that I put up there is very, very much what Bowlby operates on. However, when asked about energy and instinct, Bowlby would say it's probably there, but I can't really address it because we don't have any hard evidence. And there's no evidence. He must have, and I'm sure, but research has not, the archives have not uncovered anything that shows that Bowlby actively knew of Reich's work, or actively, but he clearly knew people that knew Reich. So I've established, for instance, that just before Bowlby went into child psychiatry, he had spent his summer just before that at Summerhill doing an internship, and decided that as a result of that he wanted to work with children. So if he knew Neil, he knew, although it would have been just around the time that Neil was getting involved with Reich, but it was clearly, it stands to reason. Also, Bowlby was the mentor and the one person that R.D. Laing, I don't know, there was a time when everyone would know who R.D. Laing is. Does everyone know? Okay. R.D. Laing, who was a radical psychiatrist and analyst, Scottish analyst, who became sort of a rock star of sorts, also was schizophrenic and very troubled and very deeply, and it wasn't helped by the fact he was also an advocate of LSD, and LSD, and alcohol too. And alcohol too, and loved sex and drugs, right. sex and drugs and stimulants. Okay. Anyway, but Laing was quite brilliant, also very interested and very positive about Reich. So we know that they probably, and Bowlby was the only one that Laing would talk to from the establishment. So Bowlby was a very sort of lovely, from all accounts, people that I know who knew him, very, very just affable and available in certain very basic ways. Bowlby pretty much, and Ainsworth pretty much looked at child development in terms of describing how children operate, how children interact, and what the nature of their relationship with the primary caregiver is. And they develop a model, which I'm not going to go into great detail on, of the role of attachment, which is essentially a simple behavioral function, which primarily, it's not the way that we commonly use attachment. So what I tell my students all the time is that when we talk about attachment, we usually think about hugging, moving towards getting attached to, or attachment for Bowlby and Ainsworth is simply a triggered behavioral, a discrete behavioral mechanism, right? Which is essentially when there is a threat in the environment, in the surrounding environment, the child or the young animal, right, essentially seeks protection, seeks shelter, seeks help, seeks, you know, care, and the parent or caregiver offers protection, and essentially, so there is a trigger. So the classic would be child is playing, there's a loud noise or scary, you know, noise stimulates fear. Child's discrete behavior of play stops, turns off. Attachment behavior turns on. Adult who's available is available. Caregiving behavior turns on. Child runs, gets attached. Attachment stops, and then you know, comfort, soothing, protection, or flight if it's really dangerous. If you look at chimps, it's like up, hold on tight, and we're on the move. Whichever it is, it's a very simple biological behavior, and that was very interesting to me. Even though Bowlby doesn't address the kinds of things that we've been talking about here today, that it clearly leads increasingly towards the understanding that human behavior in animal behavior is really an organization of basic biological functions, you know, in nature, in natural settings. And that at some level what interferes most profoundly with this natural function is how the adults who rear these young operate around these basic behaviors like attachment, play, sexuality. You know, although most attachment theorists do not talk much about sexuality. It's fascinating. It's not a big, although it's more recently becoming that in terms of the recent developments in attachment theory. But mostly, and almost always interestingly, issues of sexuality in contemporary attachment theory, which is getting very active, are about sexual abuse in childhood and sexual trauma in adult relationships. It's almost, to my knowledge, and people might be more familiar with the literature that exists on healthy, functional sexual relationships, but I haven't found any. It's almost all about trauma. So basically, throughout the 60s or so, Bowlby's work and the work of a few other, Ainsworth, a few others, remained fairly off to the side and was not part of mainline psychoanalysis. I don't know whether Dr. Weitzner would comment, you know, whether Bowlby is even much talked about today in traditional psychoanalytic circles. He's sort of they're uncomfortable with him even as they take in some of his basic ideas. So, to move it along quickly, since we're trying to. Essentially, what's happened in the last 10 years or so has been an explosion of interest in the impact of these early childhood developmental processes, right, on adult behavior and adult personality. And so what's happened is there's been an explosion of interest in adult attachment behaviors, adult attachment disorders, mostly looking at pathology, pathological development. And the model is very useful because it does present a very, very good approach to its understanding how pathology emerges from interpersonal relationships. And I worked with Daniel Stern, who was one of the people who developed methods of studying how behaviors, you know, operate naturally interpersonally. And what's the biggest significant breakthrough was the development of a means of evaluating adult attachment patterns. And this resulted in a thing called the adult attachment interview, which I was very dismissive of for a long time because I was just interested in child behavior. But actually I had a chance to work with one of the key figures, Howard Steele, who was at the New School. I've been co-teaching with him, of course, on attachment for graduate students. And I've been convinced that the adult attachment interview is an extremely useful tool for understanding human adult behavior and how adults then interact interpersonally with each other as well as children. What all that means in terms of psychosomatic issues is that increasingly, when you read the literature of those people who are doing work in adult attachment or attachment, there's been an increasing interest in the somatic expression of, or whether there's a somatic anchor to these behaviors. And what emerges is a group of, there's a whole group of researchers. Key names are people like Alan Shore, David Siegel, Peter Fangay, David Wallen, all of whom are very, very big names if you're in the field. All of whom, Shore and Siegel are neurobiologists and neurologists, and have looked at the actual physical alterations in the neurological system and brain function when attachment behaviors are either disruptive or activated. And so there's been a huge building, and there's a lot of stuff on hormonal reactions, hormonal levels, all of which is very, very impressive. All of which, however, when you read, takes you to the point where we talked before, that all this literature, which I've now had a chance to really review, constantly moves towards the issue of embodiment, or the body, or the somatic and the function and the experience of body in interpersonal relationships. And all of them come very, very close to what Dr. Schiff was talking about in terms of what the presentation of somatic psychology as a discipline. And yet none of them, we were talking about this last night, none of them are able to really see how this all gets organized, or what this all serves, other than the fact that it's a phenomenon they can describe, as existing. And so it seems to me, just on a very suggestive level, that what orgonomy offers, or what Reich offers, or what orgonomic insight offers, is a way of beginning to understand how these somatic operations, somatic functions, are organized, and what they regulate, what these patterns of behavior actually are driven by, and what they regulate, which ultimately, for me, comes back to, and is very clear in a lot of literature, particularly the neurobiological literature, is it regulates issues of pulsation, of experiencing pleasure, anxiety, you might call it, or physical pleasure, sensations of pleasure, physical sensations of anxiety, expansion and contraction. And so I think there's a very real interface, but when you read the literature, the people in attachment theory don't want to go. They get up to the next step. And it's not that they don't find Reich; they don't have to find Reich, but they can't go beyond, and they ultimately come back to essentially traditional psychoanalytic, theory. Although there's been an introduction now of mindfulness and other ways of trying to understand experience and the experience of these somatic realities. So is that enough time? I mean, it's very, very, hopefully more can emerge if you ask questions. It's not exactly the way I'd hoped it would. The only other thing I would say is that for Reich, it sits on the issue of energy. And the traditional attachment work that's going on now cannot quite get to. But they can't get to that in any of the somatic study. And the best place to go for the person writing about this and really getting the best insight in this, hopefully this book will come out soon. A number of people here have been close with him and heard his presentations. Is James Strick, who is a professor and historian of science, is working and contracted with Harvard to publish a book on the development of Reich's scientific work, and hopefully that'll be out in the next whatever years. What?
2013.
Well, we'll see. But within the next few years. But his overall organization of that in relation to Reich, and why they can't go to Reich, or why Reich isn't available for these kinds of unifying field theories, in a sense, is very, very productive and very, very solid.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Weitzner and Hugh Brenner will now have a chance to respond, and I'll introduce you as he comes up. So I lost my sheet. You'll have to introduce yourself. The sheet tonight.
My name is Hugh Brenner. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner and a member of the Institute for Orgonomic Science for a good number of years.
And an orgonomic practitioner.
And an
trainer in Philadelphia area.
One of the questions that come, well, let me back up. I think in the end of Function of the Orgasm, one of the statements that Reich makes is that mental illness is the inability, is an expression of the inability to love. And certainly attachment theory is all about, without that initial attachment, there's no love. One of the questions that comes up in discussions of armoring and how armoring works and affects mental illness these days is also how it affects the neurochemistry, because this is always part of the discussion when it comes to mental illness. Is, the traditional psychiatrists are always talking about the monoamide theory of the serotonin and the dopamine. And attachment theory can sort of give us a little bit of an idea, at least looking at it from a biological point of view, in that the hormone oxytocin, you talk a little bit about the hormones there, is the hormone that's the main, seems to be most closely related to attachment. It's the hormone that not only in humans but throughout birds, other mammals, is excreted during breastfeeding, during birth, in fight or flight responses, and during orgasm. So this is a hormone that's sort of linking the attachment with the child and mother with the sexual bonding between adults. Now, exactly how armoring, affects oxytocin, we don't know. It's an interesting question. There is evidence that kids with autism have lower levels of the oxytocin. And kids with autism, of course, have the inability to form these bonds with people. So I don't have the answer to that, how the armoring affects the neurochemistry, but it's sort of in this area, it's one that we get close to seeing that link. And I think it's an interesting part.
And the issue would be vice versa too. How the chemical interactions affect armoring, and what are the biochemical underpinnings of it in the organism. We could certainly look at it from an orgonomic perspective and talk about metabolic processes of metabolic processes of dealing with orgone energy in terms of the organ expansion and contraction, but what the actual mechanisms that take place biochemically and bioenergetically in the organism once these expansions and contractions are either initiated or produced or inhibited also remains to be seen. But part of the problem is because the emphasis in traditional research is on describing what specifically can be observed, there isn't much interest in looking at issues, and since energy is not conceived of as one of the primary things to study at this point, there isn't much basis unless we set up our own research projects.
Go for it.
Well, as Dr. Lewis said, it's difficult. It can be difficult to see Bowlby as a psychoanalyst because he rejects the standard theory of instincts
And drive.
I'm thinking back to the way Reich formulates the Freudian theory of instincts in his psychoanalytic work, and whereas Freud talks about primary narcissism, a stage where you're not yet in contact with objects, Reich, in contrast to Freud, talks about the beginning of life as a state where there is instinctual energy needing to be discharged, and that the infant, the newborn infant, turns immediately to the outside world to seek objects, to love, essentially. But there's a problem for me in Reich's formulation, which is not his fault, but I think the problem was there, which is that he talks about health, sexual health, psychic health, energetic health, as the capacity to pulsate freely, to discharge energy in a free and rational way. But he doesn't talk about how that is influenced by the environment, or about in what way the environment is necessary for that to happen, except in his well-known criticism of society, his political analysis of society, where he saw that there is an anti-life, authoritarian, anti-sexual social structure which gets internalized in the armored individual. So I think that looking at a theory like Bowlby's, could be very valuable, because it gets us asking, well, what is it, this energy pulsation that we're trying to reestablish in our patients, or the resolution of conflict if we're working psychoanalytically, to what extent does it depend on environmental influences? To what extent does it depend on experience? And to what extent are we able to isolate the healthy organism by itself? And to what extent do we have to see it as embedded in an environment?
And keeping in mind that with we're coming back to what Dr. Schiff had started about the role of the practitioner, the therapist. Interestingly, the attachment therapists, most of them who practice and use attachment, are very, very much more in line with Frienzi and Reich in terms of being active, being physically present, actually hugging, kissing, even supporting. It's interesting coming full circle to Frienzi, in a sense of the shock of Frienzi having a patient sit on his lap and rocking them and soothing them. With attachment training, most of the attachment therapists would encourage and support the idea of being very physical with patients, and not there's always the risk of.
But the idea of being held, being cared for, is really not what we generally think of as part of the sexual instinct. We think of that as an ego instinct or a self-preservative instinct. You need to have something in your biological nature which can satisfy the needs of safety and stability in order to have love. Right.
Well, I think the key here is Reich himself said that one of his biggest at the end said one of his biggest mistakes was using the word sex. Because it carried what?
Amen.
Yeah, because it carried with it so much baggage. And he said he realized, I think at one point he was talking about, he realized that when he gave his first presentation to the psychoanalytic community in like 1921 or something like that, which he was a child, and one of the old timers, it might have been Abraham, whatever, came up and said, "Brilliant lecture, but did you have to use the word sex so much?" It was like, in a sense, that the sense, I think that Freud also understood that there was no way to avoid it, but it was getting them, and for Reich it got him, it was so misunderstood, so that I think towards the end, Dr. Schiff and I certainly have talked about this, and clearly got this from Dr. Sobey too, and others, that Reich was less interested in talking about orgasm as orgasm or sex. It was he used much more the term of pulsation, of contact, of much the same kind of things you're talking about. So that it's not about whether you're going to have a sexual contact or a sexual interaction with a patient, but whether you're going to be able to comfort, contact, support, create a sense of a deep interpersonal communication, and giving that, in a sense, it's very much. I remember Dr. Sobey saying at one point, is that ultimately what we really try to do is is work through parenting processes that haven't gone right, someplace along the way for a variety of reasons. Not because the parents were, the ultimate thing, not because your parents were bad, but because because they couldn't get it right either. They didn't get it right either. But to try to alter or correct or at least repair some of the damage that was done. And if you can do that, in order to do that, you need to start thinking about different ways of approaching the body, and different ways of approaching the organism, and different ways of approaching what impact that has on emotional and behavioral experience. So the attachment, people really working actively in attachment are really coming towards this kind of sort of embodied therapy, a therapy in which the therapist is as much present in the room, or not even in the room, in the process, and as much it's less about transference and countertransference and more about you and me and how we're personally, communicating, and what kind of integrity there is in the interpersonal communication. I guess we should go to questions.
Yeah, I'm curious why you didn't discuss Winnicott and the object relations. People are also concerned with that because Free Associations, their journal, actively discusses Reich and the question of parent-child interaction, the whole idea of the holding environment, in fact, which I think is more conducive to a synthesis.
I never really, I find Winnicott very, very duplicitous personally in my readings of him. So that he's never been one of those people that I've trusted very deeply. I actually don't know the specific journal. I know it exists. It's not one
because they're very much about tying Reich in inside feminist psychoanalytic insight about
Winnicott himself and the work of Winnicott does not. Obviously, the group has moved in directions that Winnicott himself was not prepared or comfortable. Winnicott remains very much, pretty much in his own work within the rather traditional object relation. He's one of the most conservative of the object relations people. The later stuff, the people who I'm talking about are more involved with things like the Journal of Human Development and Attachment in Human Development. That's Howard Steele and Miriam Steele at the New School of React, and that's really more where this work is coming. Winnicott, in our attachment seminars, we deal with Winnicott, but Winnicott is. Well, Winnicott is Winnicott, I mean, that's a whole other discussion. A part of the reason I didn't get into it is because I had a limited space to address or introduce the idea. But these are potentially possible areas that we should more people, if people are really interested, we should have more, seminars or smaller groups meeting to discuss and study and interact with. I don't know if that's an answer, but
sure.
Dr. Lewis, I wanted to comment, actually, because attachment disorder is so hard to treat, a lot of adoptive parents have just thrown up their hands with the treatment field altogether and kind of gone far afield into some various things that look almost like physical therapy. There's a lot of somatic work, some use of EMDR, and they're actually having a little success. It remains pretty hard to treat, but you can actually get a little shift.
Well, part of the problem with that, and Bowlby actually addresses that in his initial work, that the single most traumatic experience is having a parent who is not the biological parent try to establish, have a child and parent establish an interpersonal relationship, caregiver-child relationship, and it's very, in Bowlby's view and in the view of many of the attachment, attachment theorists, it's very possible to do, but these are exactly the adoptive situations are exactly the situation which needs the greatest support, the greatest, background, the greatest work, not just on the child, which is where it often tends to be focused, but on the parent in terms of the caregiver and what they're capable of doing with the child. It also depends on the state of the child when the child comes into an adoptive situation. But the biggest success is usually with very young children in the very initial. The patients that I've seen who have adopted at birth, children at birth, or patients who have been adopted at birth, seem to me to present usually a very similar trajectory as any other patient. I mean, the issue of adoption might play in some ways, but it's not nearly that crucial. So the issue is building better networks, and most of the work done with adoptive parents is very, very low quality, in my view. Okay, one last question?
I'm just struck by Alan Shore's work was when you mentioned him, and he talked about resonance between the caregiver and the baby, and that the pattern of resonance and the frequency of resonance had a direct relationship to the proliferation of neuron development in the right prefrontal cortex, and that there was a great deal of research now about how adequate brain development proceeds from the quality of the resonance in that dynamic interaction.
It's very, very, it's all very cutting edge and very wonderful stuff. The one problem always is when you question what to do with this knowledge, it becomes harder to come up with it. But what's interesting is that these patterns of resonance and these patterns of resonance and these observable phenomena are very strong and open to further work, and probably will influence the way that we work. If we could, we got the high side that it's our little.
You're on there.
Just
Yeah.
way back in the seminars, I just remember them talking about the energy that passes between the child and parent. They really think that also develops out how the child looks, where they are immediately. So that's
Well, I mean, if we could go into more, I mean, the work of Dan Stern, which was very, very instrumental in terms of really looking at interpersonal relationships and how they operate, is very, very crucial way of looking at it and studying it. It would be nice to look at that stuff and look at it in terms of its relationship to this neurobiological model. Dan Stern.